had always loved camping. Not the kind where you park an RV at a crowded campground with a store nearby selling marshmallows and overpriced firewood. I'm talking about real camping, the kind where you carry everything you need on your back and walk miles into the wilderness. The kind where there are no bathrooms, no cell service, and no one around for miles. That was exactly what I was looking for when I planned a solo trip to the forests of Montana in the summer of 2016. I had done plenty of solo trips before, so I wasn't worried. I had my gear, my food, and my bear spray. I had checked the weather, studied the terrain, and let my brother know where I was going. Everything was set. I drove for hours until the roads turned to dirt, then parked my truck near the base of the mountains and started hiking. The first few miles were peaceful. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the dry pine needles and the distant calls of birds. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth. By mid-afternoon, I had covered about 8 miles and found a perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving river, far from any trails. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, and gathered some wood for a fire. As the sun set, I cooked a simple meal, just some instant noodles and beef jerky. The fire crackled, sending up a column of smoke that drifted lazily into the trees. I leaned back against a log, feeling completely at peace. But then, as the last of the daylight faded, I noticed something odd. Across the river, maybe 50 yards away, there was a man standing at the edge of the trees. I froze. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows. He had no gear, no backpack, nothing that suggested he was a hiker or a camper. He was just there. At first, I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. The way the branches swayed in the wind, the flickering light of my fire, it was easy to imagine shapes that weren't really there. But as I stared, the figure remained. I told myself it wasn't anything to worry about. Maybe he was another camper, though I doubted it. Maybe a hunter. Maybe just some guy walking through the woods. Still, something about the way he was standing, so still, almost too still, made my skin crawl. I forced myself to ignore it. I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin my trip. I threw another log on the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it shut. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound outside had me on edge. The rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the distant snap of a branch. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the forest. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I woke up groggy but relieved that nothing had happened. The sun was shining, the river was glistening, and the eerie feeling from the night before almost felt silly. Almost. I packed a small bag with snacks and water and set out for a short hike. I didn't go far, maybe a mile upstream. I found a good spot to fish, caught a few trout, then headed back to camp to cook them for lunch. Everything seemed fine, but as I was cleaning up, I looked across the river again. The man was there. Same spot, same stillness. Only this time he was closer. Maybe 30 yards away now, still on the other side of the river, but definitely closer than before. My stomach turned. I tried to act like I didn't see him. If he wanted to come over, he'd have to cross the river, and the water was deep enough that I'd hear him splashing through it. But I kept my knife on me, just in case. Hours passed. The sun started sinking again. I kept an eye on the other side of the river, but eventually, I stopped seeing him. I started to relax, telling myself that whoever he was gone. But that night, as I lay in my tent, I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human. They were slow, deliberate, just outside my tent. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. I gripped my knife, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing every few steps. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps faded. I lay awake until the first light of dawn. I had planned to stay out for a week, but that morning, I knew I was leaving. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. My hands were shaking. My skin was clammy with sweat, even though the air was cool. As I started hiking back to my truck, I felt exposed. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees, and every rustling branch made me flinch. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see him. The whole way back, I had that feeling like I was being watched. Then, about a mile from my truck, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. On the trail ahead of me, right in the middle of the path, was a small pile of rocks. Not random, arranged, a marker. Someone had been there before me, and they wanted me to know it. I stepped around it and picked up my pace. My truck was just ahead, and I practically ran the last 100 yards. When I got to the truck, I threw my pack in the bed, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I tore down that dirt road faster than I ever had before. I didn't stop until I hit the highway miles away. I don't know who that man was. I don't know what he wanted, but I know he was real, and I know I wasn't imagining things. A week later, out of curiosity, I looked up missing person cases in the area. There were a few: hikers, campers, hunters, all gone without a trace. I haven't been back to that part of Montana since, and I never camp alone anymore, because sometimes the scariest things in the woods aren't bears or wolves. They're people. I had been camping alone for years. It wasn't about proving anything to myself. I just liked the quiet. I wasn't one for crowded campgrounds or guided hikes. I liked the kind of places where you could walk for miles without seeing another person. That's why I picked this valley. It was remote, deep in the wilderness, and I had only ever heard of a few people going out that way. The nearest town was a small place with a gas station, a diner, and maybe 100 residents, most of them retired. I had stopped there to fuel up and get some last-minute supplies. The old man at the gas station barely looked up from his newspaper when I asked if he'd heard of the valley. "Not many people go out there," he said, turning a page. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. It was late October, and the air was getting cold. I liked that. It kept the bugs away, and I wouldn't have to worry about other campers. The trees were almost bare, their twisted branches reaching up like skeleton fingers. The ground was covered in dead leaves, and the wind sent them skittering across the dirt like something alive. I parked my truck near a trailhead, packed up my gear, and started hiking. My pack was heavy, but I was used to it. I had everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a knife, and my old rifle, just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I always brought it on trips like this. You never know what kind of animals or people you might run into. The hike was hard. The trail wasn't maintained, and it was easy to lose it under the leaves. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling in the bushes, just the wind. That should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Took me most of the day to reach the valley. It was beautiful. Tall cliffs on both sides, a river running through the middle, and a dense tree line along the base. The ground was soft, perfect for setting up camp. I picked a spot near the water and pitched my tent, unpacking my gear and setting up a small fire. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I layered up, cooked some food, and sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood. That's when I heard it, a sound from the trees. Not the wind, not an animal. Something moving. I froze, my body on edge. It was faint, just the sound of leaves shifting, like someone stepping carefully. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dark tree line. Nothing. I waited, my ears straining. Silence. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. Something watching from a distance, curious about the fire. but the feeling didn't go away. I forced myself to eat, though I wasn't hungry anymore. I tried to relax, staring into the flames. The sound didn't come back. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just jumpy because I was alone in an unfamiliar place. I stayed up late, letting the fire burn low before finally crawling into my tent. I don't sleep easily in the woods, not even after all these years. I woke up a few times listening, waiting, but I didn't hear anything else. When morning came, everything seemed normal. The sun was bright, the air crisp. I shook off the unease from the night before, made some coffee, and spent the day exploring. I hiked up one of the cliffs, looking down at the valley below. From up there, my campsite looked tiny. The river cut through the land like a scar, winding through the trees and disappearing into the hills. There was no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I built my fire bigger. I kept my rifle closer, and once again I heard it. This time it was closer. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I didn't move. I held my breath, staring into the darkness. The fire crackled, sending flickering light into the trees, but I saw nothing. Then another step, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing. The trees stood still. The ground was covered in leaves, undisturbed. I held the light there for a long time, waiting. My fingers tightened around my rifle. Nothing. I turned off the flashlight but kept the gun across my lap. I wasn't going to bed this time. I sat there for hours, staring into the dark. The fire burned down to embers, and I added more wood, watching the flames climb higher. No more sounds, no more movement. Eventually, exhaustion won. I didn't want to sleep, but my body did. I crawled into my tent, keeping my rifle beside me. I don't know how long I was asleep when I woke up to the sound of my tent zipper. Slow, deliberate. I stopped breathing. Something was outside, right there. I reached for my rifle, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would shake the tent. The zipper moved again. I pulled back the hammer of the gun. Silence. Long, suffocating silence. I waited, my finger hovering over the trigger. Then, footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps moving away from the tent. I held still until the sound faded into the trees. Then I moved. I unzipped the tent fast, rifle raised. Nothing. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The woods were still, but I wasn't alone. I packed up my gear in minutes. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of that valley. I shouldered my pack, rifle in hand, and started walking. I moved fast, barely stopping for breaks. The whole way back, I felt it, something watching me. Every so often, I would stop, turn, scan the trees. Nothing, but the feeling never went away. By the time I reached my truck, my legs were shaking. I threw my gear into the back, climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I looked back toward the trail, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just at the tree line, too far to see clearly, but close enough to know it was watching me. I didn't wait. I put the truck in gear and got the hell out of there. I don't know what was in that valley. I don't want to know, but I'll never go back. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a constant patter against the thick canopy of trees above me. It wasn't a light drizzle, but a relentless downpour, soaking the earth and turning the narrow dirt road into deep, sticky mud. My boots were already caked in it, my jacket heavy with the weight of absorbed water, and my backpack pressing against my shoulders like a sack of bricks. I was deep in the woods, miles from any town, and camping alone. The plan was simple: 3 nights off-grid, just me, my tent, and nature. No distractions, no people, no schedules. Just silence and fresh air. The kind of quiet that lets you clear your head, reset from the world. That had been the plan, at least. But now, standing in the rain with my flashlight cutting through the misty darkness, something about this night felt wrong. I wasn't new to camping. I had done this plenty of times before, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. I knew the rules: respect nature, prepare for the worst, always have an exit plan. But something about this trip felt different from the start. I had felt uneasy since I stepped out of my truck and into the woods earlier that day. It wasn't the weather. I had checked the forecast, packed accordingly. It wasn't the location. I had camped in remote areas before. It was something else. I had chosen a clearing next to a small creek, a spot that looked untouched. No signs of previous campers, no litter, no remnants of old campfires. It was perfect, at least at first glance. But as I set up my tent, I noticed strange details. The ground had been disturbed, not fresh, but enough for me to tell that something had been moved. Small patches of earth turned over, some rocks arranged in a way that didn't feel natural. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons digging around. I didn't think much of it at the time. By the time night fell, the rain had already started, light at first but quickly picking up. I sat under the tarp I had rigged up, eating a quick meal from a tin can, listening to the wind move through the trees. The forest was alive with sounds: branches creaking, water rushing over rocks, leaves rustling. Normal things. But then, somewhere in the distance, I heard something that wasn't normal. A sharp crack like a branch breaking under pressure. Then another, and another. I stopped eating, listening more closely. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Something moving through the woods, breaking twigs underfoot. It was too steady to be an animal. Too slow, too careful. I clicked off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the dark, my heartbeat slowing as I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to panic over noises. It was probably just a deer, maybe a stray dog. The rain could make everything sound worse than it was. But then the footsteps stopped. For minutes, maybe longer, there was nothing. No movement, no sound except the rain. I stared into the darkness, my ears straining for any sign of whatever had been there. Then, just as I started convincing myself I had imagined it, I heard something else. Closer this time. A rustling sound, just beyond the tree line. The unmistakable sound of something brushing against wet leaves. It was faint, but there. I kept still, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, the embers casting a dim, flickering light. I reached for my knife, gripping it without thinking. I wasn't going to run. Not yet. Another sound, this time to my left. Closer. Something was circling my campsite. My body went cold, adrenaline flooding my veins. I wasn't alone out here. Someone or something was out there just beyond the trees, watching. I forced myself to move slowly, quietly, reaching for my flashlight. I turned it on and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing, just rain and darkness. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the perimeter of my campsite, but saw nothing out of place. But then, just as I was about to turn the flashlight off, something caught my eye. A shape, dark, unmoving, standing just beyond the reach of the light. At first, I thought it was a tree, but then I noticed the outline was wrong. Too narrow, too tall, and it wasn't swaying with the wind like the branches around it. I aimed the flashlight directly at it. Nothing. Whatever I had seen was gone. The rain picked up, hammering against my tarp, drowning out all other sounds. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where the figure had been. My mind raced through every possibility. A trick of the light? My imagination? Or was someone really out there? I didn't wait to find out. Moving quickly, I grabbed my gear and threw it into my pack. I didn't bother breaking down my tent properly. I just collapsed it, stuffing it inside. I could get a new one later. Right now, I needed to leave. I slung the pack over my shoulders and turned toward the trail, my flashlight cutting through the downpour. The mud made every step slow and difficult. My boots sank deep, pulling at my legs, but I kept moving. I was maybe 100 yards from camp when I heard it again. A single, deliberate footstep, then another. Someone was following me. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I kept moving, pushing forward, focusing on nothing but the path ahead. My truck wasn't far, maybe a mile away. I could make it. I had to. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, dark and tall, moving through the trees parallel to me, keeping pace. I moved faster, forcing my legs through the thick mud, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The rain blurred everything, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran. I didn't care about making noise anymore. I just needed to reach the truck. The path finally opened up, and I saw it, the faint reflection of my truck's headlights in the rain. I sprinted the last few steps, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition, my breath fogging up the windshield. The engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the mud, and then I saw it, standing at the edge of the trees, tall, unmoving, watching me. Even through the rain, I could tell it wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it had followed me all the way here. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into drive and tore down the road, mud spraying behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the forest was nothing but a distant blur in my rearview mirror. Even now, I don't know what I saw that night. I never went back, and I never will. It was early October when my boss, his mother, and I set out for the camping trip. We had been talking about it for a while, mostly at his insistence. He was the kind of guy who liked to mix work and personal life, and I guess I was just the kind of employee who went along with it. His mom was visiting from out of town, and he figured it would be nice for her to get some fresh air, away from the city. I didn't have much going on that weekend, so I agreed. We drove up to a remote part of the country, somewhere deep in the forests of Oregon. The drive itself was long, maybe 4 or 5 hours from where we lived. As the roads got narrower and the cell signal started to fade, I started to feel a little uneasy. I'd gone camping before, but usually in places where other people were nearby, organized campgrounds, national parks with rangers. This was different. My boss had picked a spot off an old logging road, way off the beaten path. He said he used to come here years ago with his dad. When we finally got there, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The place was as remote as he had described. No signs of human activity, no campgrounds, no marked trails. Just miles of thick forest and a small clearing near a river where we set up camp. We pitched 2 tents, one for my boss and his mother and one for me. After that, we gathered firewood and got a fire going before it got too dark. His mom wasn't really the camping type, but she seemed happy enough sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea from a thermos. My boss and I cooked some food over the fire, simple stuff, sausages, beans, some bread. Felt like any normal camping trip. The first night passed without anything strange happening. It got cold, but we were prepared for that. The sound of the river nearby was actually kind of relaxing, and aside from the occasional snap of a branch in the distance, everything was quiet. It was the second day when things started to feel off. We spent most of the morning exploring. There was an old, overgrown trail leading up a ridge behind our campsite, and my boss suggested we hike up to get a better view. His mom stayed behind, saying the climb would be too much for her, so it was just the 2 of us, making our way up the slope. The deeper we went, the less the forest felt welcoming. The trees were old, towering high above us, blocking out a lot of the daylight. There was something strange about the silence. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just our footsteps on the damp ground. At one point, my boss stopped walking and looked around. "You feel that?" he asked. I did. The air felt different, heavy, like we had walked into a place we weren't supposed to be. A little further up, we found something unusual. A tree, stripped of its bark in long, deep scratches. The marks were too high up for any small animal to have made them, and too deep for a person with a knife. I ran my fingers over them. They were rough, fresh. My boss didn't say much about it. He just gave me a look and kept walking. We didn't stay up there much longer. The feeling of unease only got worse, so we turned back and made our way down to camp. His mom was still sitting by the fire, reading a book like nothing had happened. That night, I woke up to a noise outside my tent. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Something moving just beyond the firelight. I stayed completely still, listening. There it was again. Not footsteps exactly, but something shifting through the underbrush. My heart was pounding now. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped my tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned low, just a few embers glowing in the pit. The forest beyond was nothing but darkness. Then a sound, closer this time. I swept my flashlight in the direction of the noise. For a second, I thought I saw movement, something low to the ground just at the edge of the trees. But as soon as the beam hit it, it was gone. I sat there for a long time, staring into the dark, listening. But the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it had just been an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and went back inside my tent. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I didn't mention it to my boss or his mom. I figured there was no point in making a big deal out of something I wasn't even sure I saw. But then I noticed something. Near the fire pit, where the dirt was soft, there were marks. Tracks, but not like boot prints or animal tracks. They were odd, almost like handprints, but bigger, and spaced in a way that didn't make sense. I crouched down to look closer. My boss came over and saw them too. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at them. Then he muttered something about the ground shifting overnight and kicked dirt over them. That was the moment I knew he had seen something too. We stayed one more night. I don't know why we didn't just leave right then. Maybe we didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe we were trying to convince ourselves nothing was wrong. That last night was the worst. The noises came back, but this time, they didn't stop at the edge of camp. I was lying in my tent when I heard the first crunch of footsteps. Then another, closer this time. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight, too afraid to turn it on. Something moved outside my tent. Not walking, crawling. I could hear the soft drag of something pulling itself through the dirt. I sat up, heart pounding. The fabric of my tent moved. Something brushed against it. Then, nothing. For the longest time, I didn't move, didn't breathe. Eventually, I heard it again, but this time, it was moving away, back toward the trees. The rest of the night was silent. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I packed up my stuff. My boss and his mom did the same without a word about what had happened. None of us acknowledged it. We drove back in near silence. His mom made small talk, but my boss and I barely said a word. A week later, he quit his job and moved out of state. I never asked him why, but I think I already knew. I never went camping again after that. I had planned this trip for months. Just me, the woods, and a quiet weekend away from everything. I needed it. Work had been too much, life had been too much. So, I packed up my truck and drove 3 hours out of the city to a remote campsite in the middle of a national forest. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing deep in the woods that I had found a few years back while hiking. It was perfect. No other people, no noise, just the wind in the trees and the sounds of nature. I got there late in the afternoon, parked my truck on the dirt path about 20 feet from the clearing, and started setting up. I pitched my tent near the tree line, where the ground was flat and dry. A small stream ran a little ways down, so I wouldn't have to worry about water. I gathered some wood for a fire, enough to last me through the night, and cooked a simple meal on my little propane stove. The air was crisp but not too cold, the kind of weather where you needed a jacket but didn't have to shiver. By the time the sun set, I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the crackling wood and the distant sounds of the forest. Crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. The usual things. Felt good to be out here alone, away from everything. I let myself relax, watching the fire, feeling the warmth on my face. But then, sometime around midnight, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest had stopped. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals, just silence. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Sometimes, when you focus too hard on something, everything else seems to fade. But this wasn't that. The air felt heavier, the woods around me darker. The fire crackled, but beyond that, there was nothing. I scanned the tree line, my eyes adjusting to the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The trees stood tall and still, their trunks like black pillars stretching into the night sky. I couldn't see anything unusual, but something felt wrong. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The silence was just nature shifting. Maybe a predator was nearby, and the smaller animals had gone quiet. It was normal, probably. Still, I felt uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it towards the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but more trees, the occasional bush, the uneven forest floor. No movement, no animals, nothing out of place. I swept it around one more time, then turned it off. I forced myself to relax, stirring the fire with a stick, adding another log. The flames flared up, casting flickering shadows along the ground. I kept telling myself there was nothing out there. Then I heard it, a sound, not from the trees in front of me, but from behind. A crunch like a footstep on dried leaves. Slow, deliberate. I turned sharply, flashlight in hand, aiming it towards the noise. The beam landed on my truck. The trees beyond it stood still, dark. My backpack was by the passenger side door, exactly where I left it. Nothing was there. I scanned the ground, looking for movement. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then another crunch. Closer. I spun, shining the light towards the tree line again. Still nothing. At this point, my body had gone into full alert. Every hair on my arms was standing up. My breathing was slow, careful. My heart was pounding. Something was out there. I stood up, keeping the flashlight steady, and slowly backed towards my tent. My knife was inside along with my rifle. I hadn't thought I'd need it, but right now I wanted it close. Another crunch. This time it was right near my truck. I swung the light back toward it, my pulse hammering in my ears. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, partially hidden behind the trunk of a pine. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a person. Motionless, watching. I froze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly they stepped back. Not away, just deeper into the darkness, where the flashlight couldn't reach. Gone. I stayed there for what felt like forever, my breath caught in my throat. I waited, listening, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, staring into the woods. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a faint crunch, a shift in the underbrush, but I never saw anything else. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up fast, stuffing my tent and gear into the truck without bothering to be neat. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to leave. The drive back felt longer than usual. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind me. I didn't relax until I was back on the main road, miles away from those woods. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just some other camper, lost or curious. Maybe it was something worse. I haven't been back since. I don't go camping anymore. I used to. It was something I did all the time when I was younger. I grew up in a small town in Montana, and the outdoors was just part of life. My dad took me out into the woods before I even learned how to ride a bike. And by the time I was in my 20s, I felt more at home out there than I did anywhere else. There was something about being in the wild, away from people, away from noise, that made everything feel simpler. That all changed after one trip. One night. It was in the fall of 2016. I remember because the leaves had just started turning, and the air was getting colder at night. It was the perfect time to go camping. The bugs were mostly gone, the summer crowds had left, and the woods felt empty in a way that I liked. It wasn't my first time going alone, but it was the last. I had a spot I liked, about 2 hours from town, deep in the woods near an old logging road. Not many people went out that way, and that's what made it perfect. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, some food, my rifle. Just the basics. The drive out was easy, and by late afternoon, I had everything set up. The sun was going down, the sky turning orange, and the woods were quiet except for the sound of birds and the wind in the trees. That first evening was peaceful. I made a fire, cooked some food, and sat there watching the flames. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt off. But looking back, there was one thing that stuck out. Something I didn't think much of at the time. The forest was too quiet. Normally, there'd be owls, maybe coyotes howling in the distance. That night, there was nothing. Just the wind. I went to bed not long after the fire died down. My tent was small, just big enough for me and my gear, and I fell asleep fast. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire was out, and the woods were dead silent. Not even the wind. I was groggy, still half asleep, when I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not something small moving through the brush. These were slow, heavy steps, coming from just outside my tent. I held my breath. My rifle was next to me, but I didn't move for it right away. I just listened. The steps were circling my tent. Slow, deliberate. Something was walking around me, just feet away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. Then it stopped. Silence. I stayed still, waiting, listening for anything. A sound, a breath, but there was nothing. Just as I started to think maybe I imagined it, I heard something worse. A voice came from right outside the tent. Quiet at first, then clearer. It was my voice. It was saying my name. I froze. My brain couldn't make sense of it. It sounded just like me. Same tone, same way I say my own name. But it wasn't me. I was inside the tent. Then it spoke again. Not just my name this time. Full sentences, but wrong. The words were jumbled, like someone trying to imitate human speech but not getting it quite right. I reached for my rifle. My hands were shaking. The voice kept going, but now it was moving. Whatever was outside was circling the tent again, muttering words in my voice, over and over. Some of them made sense. Some of them didn't. It sounded like gibberish. Then I heard something even worse. The The tent zipper started moving, just an inch, just enough to make a sound. I snapped. I grabbed my rifle, sat up fast, and yanked the zipper down myself, throwing the flap open. The moon was out, barely enough light to see, and I saw it. It was standing just a few feet away. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. It was too tall, too thin. The way it stood, the way it moved, it wasn't right. Its head tilted in this weird, unnatural way, like it didn't understand how to hold itself up. And its face looked like mine. Not exactly, not perfect, but close enough that my stomach turned. It was like someone had stretched a mask of my own skin over something else. Something that wasn't human. I raised the rifle. I didn't think. I just acted. The shot echoed through the trees. The thing jerked back, but it didn't fall. It didn't even bleed. It just turned its head to the side, like it was studying me. Then it moved. Fast. I barely had time to react before it was gone, vanishing into the trees. The moment it left, the woods went back to being silent. The air felt heavier, like whatever had been there took something with it. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I sat there with my rifle, staring out into the dark until the sun came up. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. I drove back to town without stopping, without looking back. I told myself I wouldn't go camping again, and I haven't. It's been years, but I still think about that night. I still hear that voice sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, saying my name. And every time I wonder, what if I had unzipped that tent just a little slower? What if I had waited one more second? Would I still be here? I was a cop for 12 years before I quit. I had seen a lot: drug busts gone wrong, high-speed chases, domestic calls that left me staring at the ceiling at night. But there's one thing that still sticks with me, something that happened on what was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from the job. It was 2016, and I was 38 years old. My partner and I had planned a 3-day camping trip deep in the woods of northern Michigan, away from the city noise and the constant pressure of work. We were both cops, but this wasn't an official thing. Just two guys looking to clear their heads, breathe in some fresh air, and maybe fish a little. The place we picked was about 20 miles from any major roads, a quiet spot we had used a couple of times before. No cell service, no people, just trees, a lake, and the sound of wind moving through the pines. We packed light, just enough supplies to get us through the weekend, and drove out early on a Friday morning. The first day was peaceful. We set up camp, built a fire, and sat around drinking cheap beer while the sun dipped below the tree line. There was a sense of relief being out there, away from the stress of the job. Out in the woods, it was easy to forget the weight of everything we had seen over the years. I woke up early on the second morning, just as the first bit of sunlight started breaking through the trees. The air was cool, and the forest was silent except for the distant call of some bird I couldn't name. My partner was still asleep, so I decided to go for a short walk before breakfast. I didn't bring much with me, just my knife and a small flashlight in my pocket. The forest was thick, but I had a decent sense of direction. I walked maybe a mile from camp, moving through a mix of tall pines and low shrubs, feeling more at ease than I had in months. And then I smelled it. It was faint at first, just a hint of something sour on the air. At first, I figured it was an old animal carcass. That wasn't uncommon in the woods. Deer that had been taken down by predators, maybe even a bear's leftovers. But as I walked a little further, the smell got stronger. I should have turned back. I should have ignored it, let it be. But that part of my brain, the part that had been trained to investigate, to follow a lead, kicked in before I could stop it. A few more steps, and I saw something just beyond the trees. It was a body, The first thing I noticed was how out of place it looked. The way it was lying there, just beyond the tree line, almost as if someone had dropped it there and left. The second thing I noticed was the color of the skin, a sickly, pale gray, the kind of color that tells you the person's been dead for a while. I took a step closer, instinct kicking in, my mind already processing what I was seeing. Male, mid-30s, face bloated from decomposition, clothes dirty but mostly intact.
Nos shoes.
His hands were twisted up near his chest, fingers curled like he had been grasping at something in his final moments. There was no obvious sign of trauma. No gunshot wounds, no knife marks, no blood that I could see. But something was definitely wrong. I crouched down, careful not to touch anything. The smell was unbearable now, thick and sour, the kind of stench that settles in the back of your throat and stays there. Then I noticed his feet. The bottoms were torn up, shredded like he had been running barefoot through the forest for miles. The skin was raw in some places, completely gone in others, exposing flesh and tendon. Whatever had happened to him, he had been moving fast. Too fast to stop, too fast to care about what was beneath him. That was the moment my stomach started to turn. I stood up, took a step back, trying to piece together what I was looking at. The guy hadn't been here long, maybe a few days at most, long enough to start decomposing, but not long enough to be completely unrecognizable. I needed to get back to camp. I needed to wake up my partner and figure out what the hell we were supposed to do next. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every little sound made my nerves jump. Branches snapping, birds moving through the trees, my own breathing. The moment I reached the campsite, I woke my partner and told him everything. He could see from my face that I wasn't messing around. We weren't in uniform, didn't have a radio, and there was no cell service out here. That meant we had one option: hike back to the truck and drive until we could call it in. We packed up fast, neither of us saying much. The whole way back to the truck, my mind kept replaying what I had seen. His hands, his feet, that awful expression on his face. When we finally got a signal and called it in, the dispatcher asked us to stay put until local authorities arrived. It took nearly 2 hours for them to get there. By the time we led them back to the body, something had changed. The body was still there, still lying in the same position. But now there were tracks around it, fresh ones. Someone had been here while we were gone. The officers scanned the area, hands on their weapons, eyes darting through the trees. We all felt it, that heavy, gut-churning feeling that someone was watching us. They processed the scene, took photos, made notes. The coroner's team arrived not long after, loading the body onto a stretcher. One of the officers pulled us aside, his face unreadable. "There's something you need to see." He led us a few yards away to a patch of disturbed dirt. Footprints, bare ones, leading away from where the body had been. But here's what didn't make sense. There was only one set of fresh footprints, moving away from the body, like someone had stood up and walked off into the woods. The officer stared at me. "You said he was dead when you found him, right?" I nodded, my throat dry. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Then why do these prints only go one way?" None of us had an answer for that. They never did find out who the man was. No missing persons report matched his description. No fingerprints showed up in any database. It was like he had never existed. I think about him sometimes, about the way his feet were torn apart, the way his hands were curled up like he had been trying to hold on to something that wasn't there. I don't camp anymore. I don't go anywhere without cell service. And every now and then, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, just in case.